since we're talking about Rancher and this whole Kubernetes ecosystem, if you don't want to go with Rancher, what other options do you have?
Yes, and this is an interesting question for me because I wasn't really aware of the alternatives until like a few months ago when a client project kind of forced me or encouraged me to look into these things. So when we look at alternatives, we should first think about what Rancher is. Toni already gave like a nice introduction to it, what Rancher does. For people, it's a Kubernetes management platform. So with Rancher, you can install Kubernetes to multiple different environments. Maybe it's a cloud provider made from one of the big three, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, or maybe it's something like Hetzner, or maybe it's your bare metal cluster. You can install cluster there using Rancher. But you can also manage all your clusters in one place, whether they were created with Rancher or not. So even if you have a, let's say, Google Kubernetes engine running Kubernetes Google Cloud, you can view and manage it from Rancher almost the same way as if you had a Rancher created cluster. So that's the perspective I took when answering these questions. Of course, for installing Kubernetes, there's like tons of different tools. So I took like a bit like a more narrow perspective. So if you look at the vendor alternatives, there's OpenShift from Red Hat and Cisco Introsite and VMware Tanzu. I don't really operate in this space, so I don't know that much about them. But for example, OpenShift is the kind of like something that really expands on Kubernetes. They come with their own inbuilt container registry and specialized tooling and things like this. And yeah, these are like, let's say, paid vendor alternatives that do many of the similar things as Rancher does, managing Kubernetes. Right, next one. And then we have cloud provider alternatives. From AWS, we have or will have during this year with EKS Anywhere. So it's basically a way to install Elastic Kubernetes services on-prem on your own server farm or whatever. And you can also view all your clusters in one place, whether they are EKS clusters or not. From Azure, we have Azure Arc, where you can manage your clusters from one place. And you can also actually manage other things like your on-prem servers or virtual machines that run elsewhere. Azure Arc seems to be like the very like broadly featured. It doesn't seem to have features to install Azure Kubernetes service clusters on-prem. It's more like if you have clusters running anywhere else, you can bring them all under your single pane of glass management view and manage them from there. And you can also run Azure Arc enabled databases on any Kubernetes distribution running anywhere, and basically Azure will take care of stuff like backups and things like that. So it's like kind of like one place to rule them all, where you can bring everything to warm your cozy Azure home. And for Google Cloud Platform, there's Anthos, which is a way to install and just Google Kubernetes engine clusters on-prem or multi-cloud, which means that you can install your GKE engines in AWS as well. And there's one place to manage them. So all of these like cloud provider alternatives and vendor alternatives are not exactly one-to-one replacements to Rancher. Some of them do more stuff and some of them do less stuff, and they all do different stuff. And I would guess they also do their stuff with different levels of like usefulness. And I guess whether you want to go with Rancher or something else, it depends on your situation. I'm personally biased towards open source solutions such as Rancher, where I I'm not locked into anything, and I can just like run it anywhere I want, and there is no risk of not being able to migrate away. But if you are in a situation where you're already working with one of these vendors, or you are really all in on one of the clouds, then it might make sense for you to go with one of these if you like their features.
Yeah, and I think that's the solid points for Rancher, that since it's, as you said, it's open source and it uses, in the very, very background, it uses these Docker machine drivers. So even if you have a very, these very like obscure indie cloud providers, but you have a Docker machine driver for it, you can just use it with Rancher. So you're not locked in with any vendor, and it's open source, so you can just build on top of it to whichever solution you might need. Yes.
Do any of my fellow panelists have comments on this?
I think, Toni, since you're the Rancher leading expert, you might also have a outsider experience.
Well, actually, I was surprised of all of these. Haven't really researched further. Like I found my happy place to be with Rancher, so I haven't looked anything else. But interesting to see that other cloud providers have been also waking up to this, that maybe people need something more than vendor lock-in Kubernetes.
Interesting thing is that I haven't really seen, like, during my research, I did not find any open source alternatives to Rancher. Rancher seems like the kind of like the only player in this particular game that is open source. Or if any of the people in the chat have found any, please write it there.
But what is the status of OpenShift? Isn't that kind
of? Is OpenShift open source?
Yes. Alternatives.
OpenShift is open source.
Okay.
Yeah, and well, it also has the backing up from Red Hat, and for the people who already knew about Rancher before, Toni already mentioned they were acquired by SUSE some months ago. So now, even though they're still open source, they also have the backing from an open source company. So it's not a private thing, but it's still now supported by this company.